On the evening of April 14, 1865, the external order of the United States was shattered in a single moment of mechanical violence at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., as the nation was beginning to celebrate the end of 4 years of apocalyptic slaughter. Abraham Lincoln, the grand shaper who had navigated the Union through the abyss of secession, was seeking a brief moment of psychological reset by attending a performance of Our American Cousin. He was unaware that a subterranean conspiracy led by John Wilkes Booth was about to trigger a structural collapse of the federal government. Booth, a famous actor and a hyper-radical Confederate sympathizer, identified the problem that the South had lost the war on the battlefield, so his diagnosis was that only the decapitation of the Union leadership could restart the big cycle of rebellion. His design and plan was a coordinated strike to assassinate Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William Seward simultaneously. At approximately 10:15 p.m., as the biological machine of the theater audience laughed at a comedic line, Booth stepped into the state box and fired a single .44 caliber ball into the back of the president's head. The internal order of the theater transformed instantly from joy to total disorder as Booth leaped to the stage crying out the motto of Virginia, Sic Semper Tyrannis, and escaped into the night. Lincoln was carried across the street to the Peterson House where, for 9 agonizing hours, the mechanical reality of his wound proved too great for 19th-century medicine to overcome. As the sun rose on April 15th, the heart of the Union stopped beating, and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton famously whispered that Lincoln now belongs to the ages. The data flow of the assassination spread across the telegraph wires like a viral system failure, paralyzing a nation that had just begun to breathe the air of peace. In the North, the momentum of victory turned into a global wave of mourning and rage. Black citizens who viewed Lincoln as their great emancipator wept openly in the streets, while the political alpha of the Republican Party shifted toward a desire for hard reconstruction. In the South, even some Confederate leaders realized that the abyss had just become deeper, as the radical open-mindedness of Lincoln's malice toward none policy was now replaced by the unpredictable disorder of Andrew Johnson's presidency. The funeral train that carried Lincoln's body 1,700 miles back to Springfield, Illinois, became a national archetype of grief, seen by millions of people who stood in the rain to catch a glimpse of the man who had saved the ship of state. This was the ultimate risk of leadership realized. The shaper had become the martyr, and his blood was now the social glue that bound the Union together in a way that words alone never could. Lincoln's assassination did not restart the war as Booth had hoped, but it did create a legacy of trauma that would complicate the 5-step process of reconstruction for decades. He had moved the nation through the fire only to perish at the threshold of the promised land. Focus on the transition from the theater's laughter to the silence of the Peterson House. Embrace the weight of the national shock, and remember that the strength of a unified machine is tested most when its primary driver is removed. This was the tragedy of 1865 and the reason the shadow of Lincoln still looms over the American soul. In the hours following the mechanical violence at Ford's Theater, the internal order of Washington, D.C. disintegrated into a state of paranoid total disorder, as the federal government realized that the strike against Abraham Lincoln was not a lone act of madness but a synchronized, systemic attack on the American state. While the president lay dying in the Peterson House, the data flow of the conspiracy began to surface, revealing that Secretary of State William Seward had been brutally stabbed in his bed by the conspirator Lewis Powell in a failed attempt to paralyze the nation's diplomacy. Vice President Andrew Johnson had also been targeted for death, though his assassin lost his grit at the last moment and fled into the abyss of the city's shadows. This was the turning point, where Secretary of War Edwin Stanton seized the political alpha of the moment, effectively declaring martial law and turning the city into a fortress to prevent a feared Confederate uprising. Stanton applied the five-step process to the crisis. His goal was the capture of every conspirator. His problem was a city filled with Southern sympathizers and a killer who knew the backroads of Maryland. His diagnosis was that Booth would head for the Potomac to cross into Virginia. His design was the largest manhunt in human history, involving thousands of soldiers and a massive financial alpha of a $100,000 bounty. And his execution was a relentless, aggressive persistence that saw every farmhouse and swamp searched for the ghost of Ford's Theater. For 12 days, John Wilkes Booth and his accomplice David Harold played a deadly game of mechanical hide-and-seek, moving through the pine barrens of Maryland with a broken leg and a fading believability that the South would rise to help them. Booth recorded his internal order in a small diary, expressing shock that his design and plan was being hailed not as a heroic deed but as a cowardly murder, even in the eyes of many Southerners. This was the hyper-realist moment where Booth realized his brand was destroyed. On the night of April 26, 1865, the momentum of the federal pursuit finally cornered the conspirators in a tobacco barn at the Garrett Farm in Virginia. When the barn was set on fire to force a surrender, the logic of the gun took over as a Union soldier named Boston Corbett fired a single shot through a crack in the boards, hitting Booth in the neck and severing his spinal cord. As Booth died on the porch of the farmhouse, his final words were, "Useless, useless," a haunting data point that signaled the total failure of his attempt to restart the big cycle of the war. Back in Washington, the legal machine of the military commissions was already preparing for the trial of the remaining conspirators, which would culminate in the first execution of a woman by the federal government. The external order of the Union was saved, but the human machine that had driven it through the war was gone, leaving a massive vacuum of leadership at the dawn of Reconstruction. Focus on the claustrophobic tension of the manhunt. Embrace the desperate finality of the barn fire, and remember that even the most violent strike against the system cannot stop the momentum of a resilient nation. This was the secret of the manhunt, and the reason the legacy of the assassination would haunt the American identity for centuries to come. While the fires at the Garrett Farm consumed the physical remains of John Wilkes Booth, the internal order of the United States was being rewritten through the most elaborate ritual of public grief in human history, as the funeral train of Abraham Lincoln began its 1,700-mile biological journey from Washington, D.C., back to the prairies of Illinois. This was the ultimate synthesis of Lincoln's brand as the great emancipator and the savior of the Union, becoming a permanent data point in the American soul. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton realized that the psychological alpha of the nation required a period of national mourning to cement the logic of the victory, so he designed a route that retraced Lincoln's original 1861 journey to the Capitol in reverse. For 13 days, the black-draped locomotive known as the United States pulled 9 cars through the heartland of the North, moving through Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago, while 7 million people, nearly one-third of the entire northern population, stood by the tracks in a state of shared trauma to witness the passing of the ship of state. This was the 5-step process applied to the national psyche. The goal was to unify a fractured people. The problem was the boiling rage and desire for vengeance against the South. The diagnosis was that a grand sacred ritual would channel that energy into a shared identity. The design was the public lying in state in the great city halls of the Union, and the execution was a display of mechanical solemnity that saw the cities of the North competing to create the most massive displays of floral tribute and black crepe. In New York City alone, more than 500,000 people marched behind the hearse in a total concentration of force of public sorrow. However, as the martyr president was laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery on May 4, 1865, the external order of the government was already facing a mechanical breakdown under the presidency of Andrew Johnson. Lincoln's design and plan for a merciful and structured reconstruction had been a delicate balance of radical open-mindedness and aggressive persistence, but Johnson lacked the biological temperament and the political alpha to maintain that equilibrium. The vacuum of leadership created by the assassination allowed the radical Republicans in Congress to seize control of the state machine, leading to a decade of systemic friction and the eventual disorder of the Jim Crow era. The abyss that Lincoln had worked so hard to close was torn back open by the lack of his hyper-realist guidance. Yet the legacy of the assassination ensured that Lincoln's internal order, the preservation of the Union, and the end of slavery became hard-coded into the national DNA as a sacred and untouchable truth. He had moved from a shaper of policy to a sacred symbol of the American experiment. The funeral train had not just carried a body, it had carried the old republic to its grave and birthed a new industrial superpower that would eventually dominate the global order. Focus on the slow rhythmic tolling of the funeral bells, embrace the heavy atmosphere of the rain-soaked crowds, and remember that the most durable part of any machine is the idea that powers it. This was the final chapter of 1865, and the reason the shadow of the Lincoln train still echoes through the history of a nation that learned to survive its own greatest tragedy.